Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we debunk the Gaza reoccupation lie. Let's get started. On our last podcast episode, I talked a little bit about the ancestors who were kicked out of their land. That being the Jewish ancestors, not the Palestinian Arabs. And in that episode, I talked a little bit, very vaguely and briefly, about Gaza. How in the 1920s, Jews were removed forcefully from Gaza by the British forces. This is after the Palestinian Arabs, who at that point were still not called Palestinians, decided to go on a murder spree in Gaza. And in response, the British decided to pull them out and send them to Jerusalem and to Tel Aviv. Therefore, Gaza became an all-Arab place, which today people like to pretend is Palestinian land. You can go back and listen to that episode for a little more detail. But for those people who sent messages and asked me for more detail on the whole Gaza situation, this week, I felt like I would fill in a little bit of the blanks that I didn't mention in our last episode. And it's especially important now, considering what's going on in Gaza today, because the misunderstanding and the lack of knowledge on Gaza and how it became what it is today is exactly what's being used against the state of Israel. There's a myth that's going around among the left and the right suggesting that this entire war, October 7th, and everything around it is simply just to steal Gaza back from the Palestinian Arabs, which couldn't be further from the truth if you knew the history. So with that being said, we're going to try and debunk this completely ridiculous claim, one being made by many. The irony in the fact that this same talking point is used by both people on the left and the right, and the fact that I could show you two people who have made this claim, who on every other topic would never agree with each other. But on this, they agree. What can we say? Jew hate brings all the haters together. The first clip you're going to hear in a second is a very famous, unfortunately, influencer among the far right. This is a guy named Sneeko, who unfortunately has a ton of sway with the younger right-wing audience, and they buy into all of his BS. In a recent debate where he got absolutely destroyed by pro-Israel content creator Nick Matau, we can hear him make this claim about Gaza being taken over by the Israelis, and October 7th is just an excuse to do it. Here's the clip.
Since October 7th, 70 times more Palestinians have died than Israelis. Israel had foreknowledge of October 7th. They allowed this attack to happen. They used this to justify killing, bombing, destroying Gaza completely. Now it's completely leveled. October 7th was a pretext.
Wasn't a city before.
Most of the people in Gaza, yes, it was. Most people in Gaza are children. If they just wanted to retaliate, if they just wanted to defeat Hamas, they said that they were using human shields. This is how they justified bombing hospitals.
At what point do I get to answer?
If you haven't seen this debate, it is absolutely hilarious how badly Sneeko does and how easily Nick Matau, a brilliant debater, completely destroys him. But that aside, you can see here what he's doing. Is he says that this entire October 7th war was a pretext, an excuse to kill, get rid of, expel, ethnically cleanse the Palestinian Arabs from Gaza. It was all just an excuse. And under normal circumstances, it would be pretty insane to think that someone who's on the far right would say the exact same thing as the person on the far left. But now you're going to hear a clip from the Young Turk, a progressive far-left news organization, and Anna Kasparian, someone we've talked about before who's completely unhinged, and listen to what she has to say on this topic.
How many IDF soldiers have died in this genocide that they're carrying out based on an attack that happened that could have been prevented? But for some reason, it seems like the Israeli government didn't want to prevent those atrocities from being committed in Israel. Seems like they saw a possible benefit. Just 2 weeks before the October 7th attacks, the Israeli leader delivered a speech at the UN General Assembly in New York, brandishing a map of what he promised could be the new Middle East. It depicted a state of Israel that stretched continuously from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. Gaza and the West Bank, as Palestinian lands, were erased. we get to have our land, the Greater Israel Project. That's what matters the most.
Sometimes you really have to think about how insane this is. We have become so accustomed and used to this idea of the horseshoe theory, but literally hearing a far left activist and a far right activist saying identical things is pretty remarkable. This never happens other than about the Jews, but now it doesn't even make us blink an eye to see these two groups aligning on their hatred of Jews and their conspiracy theories. It's almost like they get the same talking points from the same people. So on this episode, I want to try and break this idea down to show you the history and the current events that prove that these are completely crazy theories that are completely made up in their own heads. But first, we probably should start where we left off on the last episode, where in the 1920s, Jews were very much living in Gaza, because Gaza was part of the British Mandate of Palestine. We do know that Jewish people were living in Gaza pretty much continuously since the time of the Bible. As an example, the book of Judges has the story of Samson. Many people know Samson and Delilah. It takes place him living in the area of what is now known as Gaza. Jews were living among the Philistines in Gaza. By the way, Philistines having nothing to do with the Palestinians. If you want less biblical references and let's say more archaeological, there have been found many synagogues within the area of Gaza, including the Gaza Synagogue. Archaeologists date this back to 500 CE, during the Byzantine period, and most notably found in this synagogue is a mosaic floor depicting King David, and even a donation plaque for two local Jewish merchants who lived in Gaza that paid for it. The Talmudic era, in the 4th century CE, where the Talmud refers to the Jewish community of Gaza on numerous occasions. However, there were periods where the Jewish people were kicked out and limited from living in Gaza, like during the Crusades, where the Christians expelled many Jews from living there. However, under the Mamluk rule, when the Muslims moved back in, they didn't have that restriction, and the Jewish people returned back to their homes in Gaza in the 15th century. A European rabbi who went to the area in Gaza in 1481 documented a thriving, organized Jewish community consisting of about 60 households. So you can see that Jews had always lived there. It was always part of a Jewish homeland of some sort, even under colonizers. And this brings us to about where we were in our last podcast episode, where Jews had been living in Gaza until the British took over. And due to the violence caused by the Arabs against the Jews in many massacres in the 1920s, the British moved them out and ethnically cleansed the Jews, making it an Arab-only area. As mentioned in that previous podcast, the British banned the Jewish people who had been kicked out of Gaza from ever going back. So around the year 1929, 1930, all of the Jews are removed from Gaza. And then we have the 1948 war started by the Arabs. Technically speaking, in 1947, begun by the Palestinian Arabs who weren't yet Palestinian. And this war, as many people know, led to the reshaping of the area. Egypt took over Gaza by force. They became the owners of what used to be British land and what was supposed to be Jewish land. So obviously, the Jewish people who had been kicked out by the British remained out of Gaza. It was now Egyptian land and they weren't exactly peaceful. But it wasn't until the 1967 war, when Egypt attacked again, and this time they lost the area of Gaza, in addition to the Sinai Peninsula. After winning the Sinai and Egypt and taking control, the first thing the Israelis did was they offered Egypt the land back for peace and for recognition. Unfortunately for the Arabs, as they say, they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Because that year, they had the 3 no's. All Arab countries agreed that no negotiations could ever happen with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no peace with Israel. Therefore, this deal was dead in the water. Following their next failed attempt in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, then the Egyptians were ready to make a deal. And as a part of this deal, eventually ratified in the 1980s, Israel offered them Gaza and the Sinai. They wanted nothing to do with Gaza, which then made it Israeli land. Israelis were in control of it. The previous owners who stole it didn't want it back, which makes it Israeli. So Israel was now in control of this land, And following the 1967 war, when Israel regained access to the Gaza area, the Jewish people who once lived there went back. We saw the same thing happen in 1967 in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. Once Jordan was finally kicked out of that area, the people who stole the land, the Jews who once lived there wanted to go back to their towns, go back to their homes, whatever was left. And the same thing happened in Gaza. I know this is a lot of history and probably a lot to go through in a short period of time, so I just want to do a little recap here. So we have a Jewish area that was given to the Jews under the League of Nations mandate, was taken over by Arabs, then the Jewish people were ethnically cleansed, thanks to the British, and eventually the land was captured illegally during a war by Egypt, who was only then defeated and refused to take it back. As a small side note, you'll notice, never once was it controlled by Palestinians. So now, we are into more of a modern day. We get to the 2005 disengagement plan, which you often hear many times from anti-Israel haters who like to suggest that it wasn't really a disengagement plan, or somehow it doesn't count as a disengagement because you put fences up around it, which by the way didn't come for a couple years later after Hamas took over. This disengagement that we've talked about very briefly on this podcast in other episodes was a huge controversy in Israel. The 2005 disengagement plan to remove 8,000 Jews from Gaza, some of which who had been there since the 1960s, and possibly their families even earlier, had a fairly overwhelming support at the time. In a February 2005 poll, 69% of Israelis supported the pullout, whereas only 27% opposed it. The thought process of many Israelis was, why are we even dealing with Gaza? We have to send our children in the army to go and protect the people of Gaza from daily attacks from their Arab neighbors, those 8,000 people who live there. Is it worth it? Should we just pull them out and decide, you know what, it's yours, we don't need it? And many people agreed with that. Those who opposed the idea, some for ideological reasons, giving up the land, others for realistic reasons of, we haven't had peace, we just had an intifada. Why exactly are we going to give the people who are trying to kill us their own autonomy and their own land? If anything, we need more security. And I hate to say, after some time, it seems like they were the ones who were right. Because you know the end of the story, which is that Gaza turned into a terrible place for both Gazans and for the Israelis who wanted peace. Now that we have the history, you could see the timeline here. Israel had control, lost control, got control back, and then had control, and then gave it up willingly as part of the disengagement plan. So this idea that these people are trying to promote is that Israel, I guess, wanted to use October 7th as an excuse to make up for the mistake of handing it over. Either that, or they're just so unaware of the history that they think that somehow Israel has never had control of the land and are trying to take it over for the first time. I'm not sure, to be honest with you. But this claim doesn't really hold a lot of water. Because if you're suggesting that Israel wants to keep the land, I'm not exactly sure why they gave it up in the first place. Seems like kind of a stupid idea. If Zionists plan on the Greater Israel Project, don't you think they should probably not give away the land? It's kind of counterintuitive, no? According to initial reports, the budget for the pullout, this would be the army having to pull people out, the demolition of all the homes and greenhouses and businesses that the Palestinian Authority demanded be removed and destroyed, the removing and transfer of Jewish dead bodies in Jewish cemeteries in Gaza, which had to be done because we didn't trust them not to destroy those, and not to mention resettling those people who lived in Gaza, trying to give them a place to stay, give them some startup money, which was never enough. The initial estimate was about 4 billion shekels. Unfortunately, after the fact, we know it cost 9 billion shekels, which is about 3 billion American US dollars, to pull them out of Gaza. So for those people who'd like to pretend that Israel didn't really want to pull out of Gaza, that was a heck of an expense just to make a huge mistake and go back in 20 years later. To spend that kind of money just to recapture it again doesn't really make much sense. They probably should have just kept it, assuming they wanted to keep the land, like the left and the right suggest. If I want to play devil's advocate here, which I try to do, I try and get into the mind of the people who are on the other side of this argument. They might admit that, yes, you did pull people out of Gaza, you spent a ton of money doing it, but now you realize it's a mistake, and for some reason, maybe different government or something, you want the land back. So now you're starting a war. The only problem with this is the fact that there have been 5 major operations since 2005. Operation Cast Lead in 2008, Operation Pillar of Defense in 2012, Operation Protective Edge in 2014, Operation Guardian of the Wall 2021, and then the Gaza ongoing war currently in 2023. So if we are to believe your fake talking point that October 7th only happened as an excuse to go into Gaza, why didn't they take over Gaza all of those times when they were in there fighting wars just like now? They had plenty of excuses then. They started a war last time, so why not do it then? Why in 2023 did they want to do it? And some people might suggest, well, it's because of Benjamin Netanyahu. They love to blame him for everything. It's because he's prime minister and he is a person who wants to take over Gaza. Except the problem with this talking point is the fact that Netanyahu was actually a prime minister in 2006 when Operation Summer Rain happened and Hamas had captured Gilad Shalit and held him for years. He could have used that as an excuse to take over Gaza 20 years ago. But for some reason, he didn't want to do it then and only wanted to do it now. Funny enough, 4 out of the 6 wars that I mentioned, Netanyahu was prime minister. Why didn't he do it in 2012, 2014, or 2021? So it was just really funny to hear anybody make the claim that Israelis, whether it's Netanyahu specifically or any leadership, wanted to use October 7th as an excuse when there were so many previous quote-unquote excuses they could have used and then decided not to. So why now? They really don't have an excuse or a reason for why now, apparently, Israel decided to take over Gaza, other than the reality, which is that Hamas has been a terrorist organization, has attacked them multiple times, and at this point, Israel needs to go in and get rid of them. It really is the only logical reason for all of this, but they don't use logic, they don't use reason. Maybe someone can make the claim that now's just a good time, that now the Israeli army's ready, maybe they got extra money from the Americans, and all of a sudden they're extra ready to be able to take over Gaza. The problem is, Israel's already taken over Gaza numerous times in those previous conflicts. They have taken full control. Unfortunately, this time we were stopped by the American president. So if anything, unfortunately, the Americans are stopping us from finishing the job, from taking over Gaza again. We can see the same thing happening currently in Lebanon, where Israel can easily take over chunks of Lebanon in order to remove Hezbollah without any question. Israel's army is more than capable and has been more than capable to take over all of Gaza. And yet they don't. They haven't. I wonder why. For a group that wants so badly and so desperately to take over a land, it is incredible that after 20 years of being the most powerful army in the entire Middle East, they are unable or won't or haven't bothered to take over Gaza, something that they could easily do in about a week, like they've done previously in prior conflicts. And one of the last and most pathetic and comical excuses they use is they can't take over Gaza because it's the international pressure. The international world would come down on them. Ironically, ignoring the fact that the international world has already come down on Israel and they haven't taken it over. So what's the difference? And most ironically, many of these same people will suggest that Israel ignores international law, international pressure, what Americans or Canadians or Europeans will say to them. So which one is it? Are they not taking over Gaza because of the pressure? Or are they trying to take over Gaza and ignoring the pressure? It really can't be the reason why Israel's not doing it, as long as you're suggesting we ignore international law and international pressure. In the end, this talking point is so easily debunked by the mere fact, as part of the American brokered ceasefire deal, the one that should see Hamas be dismantled, even though they disagree with it after signing that they would do it, Israel has agreed that Gaza will not be a part of Israel, that they will not take it back. The Israeli government has been very clear that the only reason they will or need to take over Gaza is to get rid of Hamas and allow for an international force of some kind, whether it's Saudi-led, UAE, some type of peaceful Arabs, that will go in and ensure that it is safe. And then they can be on their own. Hopefully, also once Hamas is gone, Egypt can open their border to allow people in. And they could have a thriving economy, both within Israel and within Egypt. Ironically, exactly how it was before the Arabs took control of the area, and it was under Israeli control. So anytime you hear this completely ridiculous talking point that Israel wants Gaza back, it just is not seen in the facts, in the actions of the Israelis. They have given it up multiple times, even though they've taken control of it. And in their own sworn agreements, they have agreed that they do not want Gaza back and will allow a multinational force to go in. Yet another proof that they don't want it back. Or else why would they agree to that? For all of these people on the left and the right who have this completely ridiculous talking point to suggest that Israel allowed October 7th to happen or are taking advantage of the fact that it did happen as an excuse to simply take over Gaza, something that they've had the ability to do for over 20 years, but I guess just forgot to do it. This is completely ridiculous. For these people, it's just an attempt to justify why they hate Israel for no reason. Under normal circumstances, October 7th would be horrible and any country would have a right to defend themselves. But if you add this idea that the reason they're doing it is for nefarious purposes, to steal land for greater Israel, then you can take away the self-defense aspect. No, you don't have a right to self-defense because you're doing it to steal land, even though you're not. As is always the case with these fake talking points, you will notice a common denominator. What they are trying to do is remove any chance that anybody can feel sympathy or empathy or even any justification for the Israelis defending themselves. And in order to do that, they need to make a reason why Israel let it happen, made it happen, or are taking advantage in order to do something terrible. So that way we don't have to feel bad for them anymore. And now we can demonize them and say they're terrible, and not the people who started the war in the first place. All because of this Gaza reoccupation myth. It allows you to ignore the October 7th attack or justify it because in the end, we'll just blame Israel for trying to steal the land, which ironically is kind of how the Arabs got it in the first place, if you look at the history. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.